BMP? Okay.
Nice hair.
No.
Hard pass.
Hard pass.
So we have about 15 folks online and 6 or 7 of us here in the room. Let's go ahead and get the meeting started. For folks that may have just joined in the last minute or two, we are going to record for today. I am Jen Sell, Principal Planner with TRPA, and we're here with Shay. I'll let you do a quick introduction. This is just a spring refresher training regarding best management practices, or as we know them, BMPs. And this is geared towards compliance and permitting staff. And we're going to go until about 1:30 today. We're going to be very cognizant of that time. We do have a hard stop at 1:30. So feel free. We'd love to see all your faces and turn on your camera. We realize this is the lunch hour, so if you're munching away and prefer to be off camera, that's fine too.
But we're eating here too, so.
Yes. So Shay, I'll turn it over to you. And let me know if there's anything that I can help with.
I was trying to put the BMP guidelines link in the chat, but it's
I could do
not.
that.
Can you do that for me? Because
Yep,
it's
absolutely.
it's not doing it. So I will just go back to the presentation. All right, well, thanks everybody for being here. This is a review of TRPA's best management practices requirements. This is for TRPA's permitting and compliance department and our third-party reviewers, as well as it looks like there's some MOU partners. And so I appreciate you guys all being here. Oops, why can I not go down? Okay. Thank you. So we are going to be going over the BMP permitting guidelines. I don't know if anyone, you can maybe still see me, but this document right here, wait, I'm going to the owl. Okay, sorry. This document, Jen is going to put the link to this in the chat. This is mandatory reading for everybody. This is super important because everything that I'm going to be going over and talking about today is in painstaking detail, spelled out step by step in this document. And if you read this, you will be well suited to be able to understand and review everything. It covers, it's focused on residential BMPs, but it also has step-by-step instructions for the calc sheet. So we are giving this training kind of following how this is laid out. If you haven't seen that, it is on the website under the permitting section, and I highly recommend that you know, in all of your spare time, read through it.
And just a quick note on that. So that is on the TRPA website, and it is a public document. So we share it with consultants and applicants all the time, and it's just a helpful kind of quick overview guide, but then it has a lot of breadcrumb hyperlinks to different resources and photos and things like that. Yeah,
and standard, I mean, the BMP details, so everything is in there. It kind of walks through step by step as you're looking at thinking about BMPs on a property. So today we're going to be going over providing an overview of BMPs, following the permitting guidelines. We're going to talk about the standard BMPs that are going to be rolled out in June. And then we're going to be talking about the calculation spreadsheet and just some sort of things that you should be looking for and common ways that people maybe manipulate the calc sheet to their advantage that we need to be aware of and be looking for when we're reviewing plans. And all of these things are important because one of our regional metrics is that we track how many properties, what their BMP status is. So whether they have a BMP certificate issued or reissued once maintenance has been done. And so these are things, as you guys are permitting projects, you're either going to be at the conclusion of that issuing a cert or reissuing a cert following maintenance.
And as we're going through it, I'll just monitor the chat. So if anyone has a question, just feel free to raise your hand and I'll let you know if I see something.
Sounds
and then
good.
We'll probably have a little time for Q&A at the end as well.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. And Joan and Angela, I know Angela's on and Joan will be joining as well. And so I also encourage them to jump in if I'm missing anything or they have something to add. They're recording. Okay, so what exactly does TRPA require? So BMP requirements are outlined in section 60.4 of TRPA code, and they were first established in 1987 with the regional plan. Installation and maintenance became a condition of project approval for permits. And then a decade later, following the 1997 Environmental Summit with President Clinton, the BMP retrofit program focused on BMPs for existing development. So TRPA requires temporary and permanent BMPs on all developed properties in the Tahoe region. These are required for every property that has development on it. The voluntary deadlines to comply have passed since 2008. So anyone who doesn't have a BMP certificate is out of compliance. And if you were, paying attention to Julie's presentation at all staff or at the board, she kind of talked about the difference between compliance and enforcement. And so this is really, we're talking about compliance, and this is something that we track for every property. So what we require for permanent BMPs is to stabilize sediment sources on the property to prevent erosion. That's also known as source control BMPs. So that includes paving parking areas, using vegetation and mulch to restore bare soil, maintaining fire defensible space, stabilizing any slopes, and preventing off-pavement parking by installing parking barriers. And I'm going to go through those in more detail. We also require all developed properties to infiltrate the design storm, which is a 20-year, 1-hour storm, which is equivalent to 1 inch of water from all impervious surfaces on the site. And runoff needs to be captured and conveyed, possibly pre-treated, depending on the land use, before being infiltrated into the ground through rock, soil, and vegetation. And research shows us that infiltration is the most effective way of removing Lake Tahoe's pollutants of concern with the TMDL, which are nutrients and fine sediment, less than 16 microns. So to ensure proper filtration through the soil, TRPA requires a 1 foot separation from the bottom of an infiltration system and seasonal high groundwater. So some properties don't have that 1 foot separation. So the code also provides for special circumstances due to site constraints. And this basically means that the property is unable to meet TRPA's infiltration requirements because of situations like bedrock or high groundwater, steep slopes, and because of these special circumstances, properties show substantial compliance by installing source control BMPs. And when they do that, they will get a source control certificate. And if it comes online or is in existence, they also will be required to participate in any available area-wide treatment. There is a handful of these around the basin, and if you look up any property in the parcel tracker at LT Info, whether they are located in an area-wide treatment or not is documented there, and we track that for every property as well. So lastly, TRPA code requires property owners to maintain BMPs for perpetuity. This is often overlooked. And please be aware of this for any property that you're working on, because we want to make sure that maintenance of existing BMPs is a standard condition, and we want to empower the inspectors to have something in the permit that says so that when they go out there, they can look at all the existing BMPs and make sure that they are maintained, so that when they pass the final inspection, we can update the certificate with a current date. And this is important, especially for commercial and large multifamily properties, because if local jurisdictions are using these properties to use them for TMDL credit, they only get 50% credit if the certificate is more than 5 years old. So, you know, anytime we go out to inspect a property, when we have a permit, that is an opportunity for us to update the certificate with a current date and make sure that maintenance is being performed. Okay, so getting started. When you're first looking at a project, there's some things that you have to think about first. The first is land use, and this is really going to affect what BMPs are needed, whether the property is commercial or large multifamily. That is triggering typically pre-treatment because you have higher pollutant loads like a gas station or a huge parking lot. There's going to be a lot more pollution generated from a property like that than a residential property. Also, lakefront properties, there's nothing between them and the lake, and there's some different things that we have to take in consideration for them, like allowing for natural drainage courses to pass through the property in a stabilized way. The next is, you know, can you go out and do a site visit? I know that this is not feasible for all planners, but if you can, great. If you can't, then we highly encourage you to look at Google Earth, Google Street View to really see what's going on. Near Map, we have a lot of resources that are available to us to really see what's going on with the property. And this is important to see if infiltration BMPs are possible or if a site constraint is present. Because sometimes properties are submitting infiltration BMPs and it come to find out they actually can't infiltrate on site for conditions. And the best way to determine that is by looking at the calculation spreadsheet. We have depth to groundwater, depth to bedrock, soil infiltration rates, all listed on the calc sheet for a property. Lastly, when you're looking at a plan is where is the runoff flowing? Are there topo lines and surface flow lines indicated on the plan? Do you know where water is actually flowing to? Because it's important to make sure that water is actually going to drain to where a BMP is proposed. And then lastly, are drainage areas clearly indicated? So this means once there is a, you know, let's say you have, we want to identify the specific areas of runoff so we know what parts of the plan are going to what infiltration treatment. So you might have a driveway BMP, but it turns out that the roof is also flowing onto the driveway. And so we want to make sure that that whole area is delineated as a drainage area with flow lines showing where that runoff is going to. So those are things that need to be shown on the plan as part of their BMPs. Okay, so again, the permitting guidelines, which we already talked about, this was put together by Arlo and Jen and a group. Its focus is on residential BMPs, but it's important to review that document, and we're going to be following the order for that. So what this guideline goes over are source control BMPs, collection and conveyance, stormwater infiltration, fire defensible space, and then temporary construction BMPs. So we're following this kind of organizational pattern when we're going through this in more detail.
Teresa, do you have a question?
I have a question, Jake.
Go ahead.
So two things. First off, is there ever a situation where partial BMPs are sufficient for if they're doing an addition, they only have to do BMPs for that partial, or they need to double check everything and review?
I think you can do new BMPs for the addition, but you should have a standard condition in your permit that says maintain all existing BMPs. So, you know, that gives the inspector the backup on the permit that the property owner signs to look at existing BMPs and make sure that they're not, that they still are in place and that they're not embedded in sediment.
So they do need to show the location of those on the plans.
very helpful.
I didn't hear somebody, I didn't.
Was there a question online? Dave, I think that might have been you, or maybe you just had your mic on.
So they do need to show all existing BMPs as well as any proposed ones on their plans, otherwise they don't know where they are,
Mm-hmm.
right? Okay.
Yeah, I would imagine if they already have a BMP certificate, then they should have.
We don't necessarily have plans that
Okay.
show those. Many number of times I've found a certificate and no plans to go with.
Okay.
Okay, so all BMPs need to be on their site plan, one or the other. Are there any situations where we can't approve a project because they can't install full BMPs?
Well, if somebody is unable to infiltrate, maybe they're site constrained, then that's when they require source control BMPs.
And we would allow that for a new project as well as on a vacant property, as well as addition, if you're not aware of any limitation on that?
I mean, I don't know. I guess you would have to try to, I know with lakefront, we want to make sure that they try to infiltrate as much as they can.
Okay. I was remembering something but wasn't sure, that there was something about if a new project on a vacant property can't install full BMPs, then we can't approve the project, but source control wasn't sufficient. That's what I was trying to clarify.
Mhm.
Anybody else remember?
I mean, I don't really want to go down.
Ignore that.
I don't, okay.
And I had one question from John Paul online. The BMP maintenance condition, you were talking about continuing to maintain.
Maintaining existing BMPs.
Maintaining existing BMPs. Is that in our attachment R? Do you know offhand? I could bring that up as we were talking to verify too.
I don't know what is in the attachment R.
Okay, attachment R is the residential standard conditions. I'll try to look that up. Or Brendan, do you know?
I feel like it is.
Yeah. We'll double check that and I can circle back around.
Okay, so source control BMPs. These are basically BMPs that keep soil particles in place by protecting them from being eroded by water or wind. And bare soil is a major sediment source, especially on steep slopes and in the winter with snow removal and vehicle tracking. So we want to use source control BMPs to stabilize soil and prevent erosion. Properties that are site constrained and install source control BMPs receive a source control certificate. Maybe that just applies to retrofit. I don't know. I think that's a discussion, like a bigger discussion that I don't want to spend time going down the rabbit hole right now. I know we acknowledge that some people are site constrained and can only do source control BMPs, and then they may have to participate in area-wide treatment down the road. So common source control BMPs include that all driveways, parking areas, and roads must be paved. Properties are allowed to pay 400 square feet for 2 parking spaces without a site assessment if no other driveway exists. If the property doesn't have the coverage to pay an existing dirt driveway or parking area, it must be blocked off and restored. And so to block an area off, you should install parking barriers to prevent off-pavement parking. I prefer large boulders, but you can use posts or bollards as well, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Restoring compacted dirt areas using vegetation and mulch. Areas need to be decompacted and mulch tilled in to restore infiltration, because if an area has been compacted and driven on, it's pretty much like pavement, and you can't just throw mulch on top and expect that it's going to infiltrate. You have to decompact that area, so you have to be aware of that and think about putting that language in your permit. You also want to make sure that vegetation and mulch adheres to fire defensible space requirements, which we'll talk about a little bit later too. Slope stabilization, you can use vegetation. This is appropriate for gradual slopes and may require biodegradable erosion control blankets until vegetation becomes established. I really want to emphasize the importance of biodegradable materials. And I'll talk about it a little bit more when we talk about temporary BMPs, but if you're installing something like netting to help vegetation become established. Jute netting is important because it'll actually degrade over time. If people are installing some other kind of netting that's plastic and that just stays in the environment, then we're just having huge amounts of plastic be put in our environment that will never come out. And so we've seen this in places where somewhere has been stabilized, and then now we just have like all this green netting that's just, you know, microplastic source in our environment. So it is really important to specify if you're using some kind of netting for revegetation that it's biodegradable. Temporary BMPs are a little bit different. The importance with temporary BMPs is we need to make sure they are removed before the project is final, and I'll get into that. If you have a steeper slope, like a 2-to-1 slope, then rock riprap is appropriate for stabilizing a slope. And you want to make sure you're using angular rock so that it is keyed in and stays in place. If you use round river rock, that's just going to roll down the slope. And then for steeper slopes, retaining walls are appropriate. You need to have engineered stamp plans for retaining walls that are over 3 feet in height, which basically means you have 1 foot below grade and 2 feet above grade. Anything over that, over 2 feet above ground, has to be engineered to make sure that it's structurally sound to hold up the slope.
Shay, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I know in the past TRPA has facilitated some training with like local contractors and things like that regarding BMP requirements. Have we done that in recent years? Or
we have a training that's been taped, and it's available 24/7 on our website that people can walk through.
Okay, specific for contractors.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can put that link in the chat.
Thanks,
That'd be great.
Angela.
Thanks.
Okay, so gravel armor under drip lines, decks, and downspouts. Armoring is basically putting a 3-inch layer of drain rock, which is 3/4 to 1.5 inch diameter, clean washed gravel, on top of the soil. So you're not excavating anything, you're just putting it on top of the soil to make sure that that soil is not susceptible to wind and water erosion. And you want to make sure that that's contained within a non-flammable border, so you can use larger rocks, like 9 to 12 inch diameter rock, to keep that gravel in place and not have soil migrate into it. For steeper slopes, you're going to use larger angular rock. It could be 9 to 12 inch diameter, or if it's really steep, 12 to 18 inch diameter. Okay, so just a little bit more information about driveways. This again is a source control BMP. As we mentioned, this should be a minimum of 400 square feet for 2 cars. We do not want to see any hourglass driveways permitted. That is what you're seeing here on the top. All that happens when you permit a driveway like this is the gravel infiltration on the side just gets driven on and compacted over time, and you're just creating soft coverage. So we want to make sure that the property isn't making the driveway smaller than what is the minimum requirements to be able to relocate coverage somewhere else. We want to see a proper rectangular driveway so that, you know, it's not just creating soft coverage down the line. And again, don't forget parking barriers. If you're using boulders, I should not be able to pick them up. If I can pick up the rock, it's too small. It needs to be something that is keyed into the ground. The standard boulder is 24 inches in height and a 3-foot diameter, but they need to be keyed into the ground for stability. And please don't position them in a line. I don't know, this is my pet peeve. I hate seeing boulders plop down in a line. We want to see them clustered and staggered to mimic natural conditions, like this lovely picture right here. And also set back to accommodate snow storage. So here, snow can be pushed, but it can't be pushed all the way to go into the vegetation. And these boulders are clustered and staggered in a way that they look natural. They're not just plopped down in a line. If you see it on the plans that they're plopped down in a line, put a note in your permit to say cluster and stagger to mimic natural conditions if you don't want them to have to like redo the plan. So that's just my little pet peeve.
And we did have a question from John Hitchcock online, asking about the hourglass driveway, if that was in our code or if that's a general understanding of we know is going to be compacted coverage.
We'll have to do some research and get back to him if there's something in the code or in the BMP handbook regarding paving. I'll have to look at that after, but in our experience, what we see is basically it just gets compacted over time, and the infiltration BMPs that are supposed to be on the side just get compacted and turn into soft coverage.
Right, so it's a general knowledge of knowing what will over time be used as coverage. And if there's a red flag to the permitting staff reviewing these plans or the inspectors knowing, okay, over time this is going to be compacted and turned into coverage, that's where we would want to address it in the permit.
Okay, moving on. Snow storage is also can be noted on the plans. This maybe is a source control BMP because you want to be able to manage your snow storage area. Either you're replenishing mulch in that area, or it might be a rock-lined area. As a rule of thumb, snow storage areas should be roughly 20% of the plowed area, as recommended by the BMP handbook. If storing snow in an infiltration basin, it's good to oversize the basin to accommodate the expected snow storage in addition to the 20 or 1 hour storm. And on larger properties, signage may be helpful to ensure the snow is pushed to the correct area. But as far as maintenance, looking to maintain snow storage and identifying it on the plans is important. So again, just helping our inspectors out when they go out to a site and see a, denuded, compacted area, and that's the snow storage area. We want to make sure that that gets maintained. Okay, moving on from source control BMPs to collection and conveyance BMPs. These are BMPs that direct stormwater runoff from an impervious surface to an area where it may infiltrate. For driveways with a slope less than 5%, you want to install a swale, which is wide and shallow, that directs the flow to the infiltration BMP. Water can also sheet flow off the driveway into an area, and the driveway should be graded 2 to 4% slope to allow for that sheet flow, but the driveway is always going to be sloped towards the street often, and in that case, it's still going to flow down, so you still want to have some kind of swale or conveyance on that driveway. If a driveway has a slope of 5% or greater, then we recommend a slotted channel drain. And the reason is that once that slope is more than 5%, when the runoff is going down and hits a swale, it's just going to jump over that swale and keep going down. And so the slotted channel drain provides a more clearly delineated area for it to then be conveyed to the infiltration system. And they also have removable grates for maintenance. And as you can see in this image, it's critical to ensure that maintenance is really critical to ensure that the runoff is adequately conveyed to where it's supposed to go. Perforated pipes can be used to convey water to an infiltration system. They also increase capacity of infiltration trench. So I'm putting them here to talk about them in terms of collection and conveyance, but we'll talk about them later with infiltration trenches and when we talk about the calc sheet. So one situation where you would want to convey runoff away from, let's say a drip line trench is on the uphill side of a foundation. So if you have a property that's built on a slope and, water's coming down or the roof is dripping and it's on the uphill side of the foundation, we really don't want to infiltrate on that uphill side because it can negatively impact the structural integrity of the foundation. We want to try to capture that runoff and convey it either to the sides or downslope to infiltrate so that we're not having any flooding or I can't tell you how many times we've had to permit BMPs because of, somebody has a second home and lo and behold, all of their drywall has been flooded and they have to tear everything out and, it's a huge expense. So it's really important to move that water away from the uphill side of a foundation. We also want to make sure that anytime you have a perforated pipe that turns a corner, any 90-degree angle, we want to install a clean out port to make sure that we can access the perforated pipe and remove any debris that might collect as it turns the corner. As far as increasing treatment capacity of an infiltration trench, sometimes a trench doesn't have enough capacity with just being filled with gravel. Gravel has a 40% void space, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, whereas a perforated pipe is 100% void space, the size of that pipe within the trench. So it can actually increase how much treatment volume can be used in that trench, and it's one way that we can increase the size of the trench, especially if there's limitations in space. We often would rather see an open system just because it's easier to maintain and it's more cost effective, but just something to be aware of because they are often on plans. Okay, so we will move on from there. Fire defensible space. This is one that is really important because we've seen a lot of plans approved by a variety of entities that haven't maintained our 5-foot non-combustible perimeter. So we really want to make sure that there is no woody vegetation. If you're looking at the landscaping plan, we don't want anything woody within 5 feet of the structure. You can have plants, but they have to be herbaceous, meaning that they grow in the spring, and when they die at the end of the season in the fall, there's nothing remaining above ground. There's no sticks that are there all throughout the winter. That is woody vegetation. And, a lot of times we'll hear, oh, well, the fire department looked at this and approved the fire defensible space plan. I don't care. I don't want to see any woody vegetation within the 5-foot non-combustible perimeter. It's really important. And, we've all lived through the Caldor fire and the Angora fire, for those of us that have been here that long. So we really want to make sure that we're maintaining that 0 to 5 foot zone around a structure. We don't want any wood borders on drip lines within 5 feet. You can have a wood border if it's at the 5-foot mark. But it shouldn't be wrapped around connecting to the house. It's much better to use non-combustible materials for a border, like larger angular rocks.
And just real quick to clarify this point about fire defensible space, TRPA did adopt some amendments just a few years ago to make it clear in our code that fire defensible space and BMPs are not considered land coverage.
Correct, and that is actually spelled out in the lovely permitting guidelines that BMPs are not considered coverage. So it's in here. I know that was a question.
And what about if you have an existing large tree next to a house? Do you just limit? Like, what do you do?
Yes. So bullet number 2. If you have a big tree that's within that 5-foot space, you don't have to remove that tree, but you do have to limit up to make sure that there's no branches within 10 feet of the roof or decking or stairs, chimneys, whatever it is. But so we want to limb that up. If it's
a sphere of 10 feet from that structure, so above, away from, below, any of that, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
5 to 30 feet is the clean green zone. So, we can have a mosaic landscape that uses a mixture of organic and inorganic materials. There's vegetation spacing requirements so that you want to make sure if you have shrubbery, however high it is, you're having twice that amount of distance between the next shrub. Thinking about it in terms of like if a pizza box size burning ember came and landed on the property and caught this on fire, is it going to catch anything else on fire? So ladder fuels, we don't want it at the base of any trees. And then beyond 30 feet, we want to make sure that pine needles do not exceed more than, I think, 2 or 3 inches of depth. So, you know, let it rake in the spring and let it fall in the fall. When you're raking, we want to make sure it's raking down to the duff layer. That's kind of the decomposed needle layer, but all of the loose material on top should be removed. Any other questions regarding fire defensible space? I know that there's, you know, local fire protection districts are doing fire defensible space inspections, and they're probably going to be looking at other home hardening things that we might not be looking at in terms of screening behind attic vents and softening of eaves and things like that. But for us, it's really making sure that we strictly have that 5-foot non-combustible perimeter.
Shay, I don't see any questions online. If you are online, feel free to either raise your hand or pop a question in the chat.
Okay, drip line trenches. These need to extend 1 foot beyond the drip line along the length of the trench. So basically, you have the drip line edge of the roof. If that is 10 feet, your roof drip line edge is 10 feet, your drip line infiltration trench should be 12 feet, 1 foot longer on either end of that drip line edge. And that's basically to allow for some extra space if there's wind or other conditions, that to make sure that the water is actually falling into the trench. Other factors to think about: when it's next to the foundation, we don't want to see the drip line infiltration trench more than 10 inches deep. And that is to protect the foundation. This is like a building code thing where we've integrated with that. So if it's a trench next to the foundation, the maximum depth it should be is 10 inches, assuming that, you know, the property has a max depth of install that's at least 10 inches deep. Again, this picture shows the use of non-flammable borders to contain the drain rock in place. We also want to make sure, you know, if you're installing a trench on a slope, that you're using baffles, because the drip line infiltration trench needs to have a flat bottom to be able to infiltrate. So if you're installing it on a slope, you want to stair step that infiltration trench down, and using, you know, baffles. Typically we're recommending using larger angular rocks to help stair step that down to ensure that the trench has a level bottom and it's not just installed at an angle. Okay. Sometimes a gravel infiltration system can be used for a driveway. Typically this is called a dry well in stormwater nomenclature, or gravel infiltration system. If you have a driveway that is having runoff directly conveyed to a gravel drive well, you need to install a sediment trap. This basically shows what a dry well looks like if it's not maintained without a sediment trap. It just helps facilitate maintenance. This is something that we've are requiring and is an adaptive management feature, because in the past, years ago, we just required dry wells, and then seeing how they the longevity of them and what they look like after a few seasons, we've required the sediment trap, and it makes it a lot easier to pull out. Sometimes you can install a gravel bag inside, and you can pull that out and dump it into the trash, or excavate it out by hand and dump that into the trash, rather than having to use a pick and you know, take out all of the rock and clean it all out. So, and this is because, not all runoff is created equal. Water from driveway and parking areas has higher pollutant loads. When you're driving around in the wintertime, you've got a giant pile of snow that builds up behind your tire, and there's all sorts of traction abrasive in that, which you can see on the picture on the left. Once that snow falls off your vehicle, you just have more sediment and debris that's going into that dry well. Roof runoff is considered clean, and so that's why we don't need a sediment trap for roof runoff, because you're not putting traction abrasive for public health and safety on your roof. It's only on the roadways that this is happening. Okay. Other infiltration systems that we like to see are what we called open infiltration systems. So these could be a dry creek bed or a rain garden or an infiltration basin. These provide a lot more capacity because there is 100% void space, and they can just hold a lot more water than using like a gravel system. And we'll talk about that more in the calc sheet, but they also are easier to maintain. You can rake them out and remove debris a lot easier than having to use like a pickaxe and dig out all the gravel and sift out the sediment from the gravel. Like other infiltration systems, they need the 1 foot separation from the bottom of the infiltration system and seasonal high groundwater. And they should have a sediment trap if they are receiving runoff from either a driveway or a parking area at a minimum, so that they can, again, preserve the longevity of the system and remove a lot of that coarse material before it goes into the basin. Okay, and then we have temporary construction BMPs. These have to be shown on the plans. These include things like construction boundary fencing, vegetation protection fencing. This was brought up. I know there was an email going around with planning from Bruce, the forester here at TRPA, saying that he's seen a lot of the planking around trees, and that is not typically vegetation protection that we want to see. Maybe it's appropriate if it's a really tight, close area and we want to protect a tree from getting hit by some kind of heavy equipment going in, but it shouldn't just be standard on every single tree. And I think he talked to you guys about that at your planning meeting.
It was, yeah. And just for the folks online that are MRU partners or WBA, some of our outsourced consultants, yeah, this was something that TRPA was starting to see, where applicants were proposing that tree banding that tightly wrapped wood planks on every single tree for their site plan. And as Shay mentioned, that's appropriate if it's along an access route or if it's really tight. But ultimately, what we'd really ideally like to see is protective fencing within the drip line. So there may be occasions where it's appropriate, but hopefully not for the entire site if they have some space available.
All right, so erosion control could be things like wattles or silt fencing. Dust control could be sweeping or even use of sprinklers depending on the site and how big of the excavation that's happening. Vehicle ingress and egress, we want to make sure that if vehicles are driving around in the dirt, that they're going to then drive over a gravel apron before they leave the site. So a lot of that sediment can get knocked off the tires. Construction staging, where they're storing their materials and equipment, and then proper handling and storage. This is one thing, in terms of talking about wattles, covering spoil piles with plastic and putting a wattle around or installing wattles. Sometimes wattles won't be in a sleeve that is made of a biodegradable material, but it's really important before we final the project that those wattles are removed. So again, once that material inside biodegrades, we don't just have a linear sock of plastic left in place forever. So this has really been an issue that's reoccurring and being brought up at various levels at the board in terms of microplastics. And so I really want to hit home, just emphasizing if you are using something that's plastic, like typically, our construction boundary fencing is plastic. Clearly, we're not going to final a project until all of that is removed. So just making sure that anything temporary that has plastic in it, that it's being removed before the project's finalized. Question, Teresa? Maybe later. Okay. Okay, commercial properties. Again, as I said before, these are properties that are generating higher pollutant loads. Think of like a gas station, 7-Eleven parking lot that has cars coming and going. There's a lot more oil and grease. And so higher traffic volumes, more pollutants. So we want to see pre-treatment prior to infiltration. Now, if there's subsurface infiltration, that's going to be because the subsurface infiltration is below the parking lot and lower in the soil profile, it doesn't have the same benefit as a basin where you have the O horizon or the organic layer where there's a lot of the biological activity happening that can break down oil and grease. And when you're subsurface, it's lower, so we want to make sure that we're doing pre-treatment with either a sand oil separator or some kind of filter to remove those pollutants before it gets infiltrated in the ground. Infiltration is still good for sediment and nutrients. If you have something like a basin, then at a minimum we want to see at least a drop inlet that is acting as a sediment trap. A drop inlet with a sump allows for water to go down and fill up before it spills over into the basin, and then that can be vacked out by a vector truck. It just helps preserve the lifespan of the infiltration BMP. Okay. Subsurface infiltration, these are more typically seen for larger projects like multifamily and commercial, where maybe they don't have any space to put a basin. And as I said, we need to have pre-treatment before you're directing runoff here. We really, if it's being put somewhere where it's in a parking lot or anywhere where vehicles are driving, we want to make sure it's traffic rated, that these storm chambers on the right in the yellow are designed in such a way that they can withstand the weight of vehicle traffic on top of them. For residential properties, in the past we've seen rain store, that's kind of what we're seeing on the left. I really want to emphasize that this is a last resort. This is really something that should only be approved if we can't make some other kind of open system, a rain garden or a basin or an open linear basin work, because it's just more plastic in the ground and out of sight, out of mind. We've had lots clog over time, and somebody goes in and buys a house and they go to install a new tree and then they're digging up this plastic grating and are like, what is this? So it's just better to have surface BMPs for infiltration because you can see them, you can clean them out more easily. It's not always feasible. So the things that are important with this is we want to make sure the clean out ports are called out and visible on the plans. And again, if you're treating runoff from a driveway or parking area, it has to be pre-treated first. Okay, and then the other thing that's an important permit condition is that if someone is installing subsurface infiltration, you need to require photos of the installation. If the inspectors can't be there on the day that it's being installed, they need to have photo documentation with a tape measure showing, yes, I am actually dug down a hole that is X deep according to my plans and calc sheet. Here is the system in place, showing the steps that I've installed it, so that when the inspector gets there later and there's like a gravel area, he can then see in actuality there truly is something subsurface, whether that's a perforated pipe or rain store or a storm chamber. We want to make sure that there's photos documenting the installation so we know for sure that it did actually get installed. One of the questions that got brought up when we kind of did the survey of people to attend this was, how do people maintain buried gravel infiltration systems, and I guess I'm bringing this up right now because it's subsurface infiltration. This is a BMP type of yesteryear that we would never really approve today. We would not approve a gravel infiltration system that is subsurface because of this exact issue that it is impossible to maintain. You can't maintain it. Any kind of subsurface infiltration, as I said, we want to have the clean out ports. A lot of times the gravel ones, there was no way to clean it out. And so the only way that you're going to clean it out is you have to dig it up and reinstall it. And so when that happens, we are often prescribing an alternative BMP and doing more of like an open basin than a buried gravel infiltration system, just because, you know, it only has so long of a lifespan before you actually have to tear it out and replace it. It isn't really maintenance at that point. Okay, moving on. Lakefront properties. So lakefront properties, in order for a property to get a buoy or a pier or be in the lottery, they need to have their BMPs. Sometimes they have to do them before they can apply and be registered to be on the lottery. Sometimes they can do it concurrent. But as I said this before, there's nothing between that property and the lake, and so there's some other BMPs that we have to think about rather than just source control and infiltrating runoff, and that is, you know, making sure that any drainages, natural drainage conveyances that are on site are stabilized so that any run-on that comes on, sometimes you'll have a roadway that just like sheet flows and discharges onto that property, and it's not the runoff that the property is generating itself, it's coming from the road, but we just want to make sure that it's going through the property in a stabilized way. So a lot of times we want to look at having more of a dry creek bed. Maybe everything is sized to accommodate the runoff that the property itself is generating, but then, you know, still allows for runoff, any additional runoff or runoff from a larger storm event to flow through the property in a stabilized way and not cause erosion as it's doing that.
There was actually a great example of that I worked with Joan Douglas on some BMPs for a property in the Skyland neighborhood, where the property owner isn't technically required to treat off-site stormwater. However, their off-site driveway was a fairly steep slope going into the driveway, and it was known that there are some issues for this place, and so we expanded their basin a little bit to try to accommodate some of the off-site.
Yeah, and it isn't that we're treating the runoff, we're letting it flow through without causing erosion, and we do have that in our code. There's a whole section about drainage conveyances, and so some of the nomenclature we use is we want to have a stabilized flow through path. You know, other issues for lakefront properties there are scenic considerations. So, you know, vegetation screening is important, making sure that any kind of rock that is being used matches the native rock that is found on the site. And BMPs should not be prescribed within the backshore. Sometimes you'll have a structure in the backshore, and you know, we might retrofit and put drip line armor under it until such a time that that property gets redeveloped and that structure will go away. But you know, having scenic considerations is really important when you're prescribing anything for these lakefront properties.
And we have a question online from Helen. She says, can you speak to when a retaining wall would be a BMP and not coverage versus when it's optional aesthetic terracing coverage?
When it is stabilizing a slope. So if you're putting in like a seat wall that is on a flat area, that I would consider coverage. But if you're using it to you know, kind of terrace a sloped area, then, you know, if they can make the argument that it is stabilizing that slope, then I would consider it a BMP.
But if that slope is stable at this point and what they're doing, their development results in instability and they have to install that wall to maintain it, that is not a BMP in that case.
I don't know, if they're building a house on an otherwise stable slope and they're excavating and building the slope, they might have to install a retaining wall as a
But
BMP.
if it's for landscaping purposes, and it would otherwise have been stable if they hadn't been recontouring above or outside of the building site, that's not required. That's not a BMP in that case. And we probably wouldn't allow it in the first place because it's outside the building site. But
Okay. Okay. Okay, so moving on, permitting. Okay, so this answered your question, Teresa. Existing BMPs shown on the site plans. Maintenance, this is important for commercial and large multifamily properties. They should also submit a maintenance log as part of their submittal. We already talked about photo documentation when they are installing something subsurface, and making sure that temporary BMPs are not just an afterthought, that they actually have them as their own plan sheet shown with their submittal. With the maintenance log, the important thing here, we have it available on our website. If you click on it, you actually have to right click on it and save it to your desktop to be able to fill it out, but we have a template. It has all of the BMPs that are typical for commercial and large multifamily property, and asks a series of questions when you're doing inspections to determine if maintenance is needed for the BMPs or not. And you know, so that's something that we would like to see everybody who is a commercial or multifamily property submit. And this way we have this template, so it's a uniform system. And if you guys have any issues with that, you can contact the Stormwater team, which I have information here in a second. So some BMP resources that we have at TahoeBMP.org. We have installation and maintenance videos that people can watch. Chapters 2 and 3 of the BMP handbook are super helpful because it talks about how to assess a site and determine what BMPs are necessary for that site. We also have the landscape conservation guidebook, which is more for residential properties and source control BMPs. And we also just recently added the photo, I'm trying to think of what it is called.
I think it's photo gallery.
The photo gallery, thank you. So here is our BMP website, TahoeBMP.org. If you go to our BMP resources page right here, this is our conservation landscape book, installation video for homeowner BMPs, maintenance videos for all these different types of BMPs, and then right here, this little camera icon. If you're working with a property owner and just want to see some different examples of what BMPs look like, they're all organized here, and you can click on the type of BMP and it gives you a lot of different examples of what they might look like. So that could be helpful in terms of educating or showing people, this is what I mean when I say a filter strip or a dry creek bed.
thank you. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And we're going to be sending out an email following this refresher training today, and we'll include just direct hyperlinks to these resources.
When in doubt, you can always contact the Stormwater Management Program, which maybe, Angela, can you just put like our phone number and email in the chat for everybody? I should have put this on this slide, but sometimes when you want to contact is if the property you think has a site constraint, we can verify that and then upload that into our database, which shows on the parcel tracker. If you need any help reviewing BMPs or calcs, please contact us. That could be anything from a single family residential property up to something like CalNEVA, which I just did recently. We are here to help review BMPs and help with the calc sheet. BMP calculation questions, and then any assistance that you need with the BMP maintenance log, or you can direct engineers to us. A lot of times, if we're working with a planner, we'll just ask for, to set up a meeting directly with the consultant, the engineer on a project, and then we can go through the plan with them step by step and address everything to make sure it calcs out.
And that's an important just resource to point out to our MOU partners as well that are on the line. I know me personally as a permitting planner, I've reached out to the BMP team. I mean, just in the last couple of weeks, they're proposing the subsurface BMP that's pretty close to a sensitive area. What do you think about this? Or, hey, I just got a driveway slope that's 13%. Are these BMP sized appropriately? So that's definitely a resource. I encourage everyone to reach out to our BMP team if you have questions when you're looking at projects.
Okay, so BMP inspections, what to look for at the final inspection. So BMPs have to be inspected, in terms of what the permit and the plan say. That's really the backup that we have for our inspectors. And so we really want to try and empower them to give them the backup that they need to be able to go out there and make sure that things are installed on the ground properly. So if there's subsurface infiltration, photos should be provided either to the inspector, or they can be provided to the planner ahead of time and uploaded to the file so that the inspector can see them prior to the inspection. Make sure that fire defensible space is met, and it should be a condition of the permit, that there should be standard conditions, standard language in there to maintain the 5-foot non-combustible perimeter. That's something that, we've seen come up, and we've had complaints from fire protection districts where, again, they're like, TRPA is not permitting fire defensible space. So it's something that we really want to, it is required, and we really want to hit hard on that. When you're checking, to see if gravel has been installed, if you go out to the site and kind of dig with your heel, I guess I'm just looking over at you, Brendan, because you're the one that's out there for the inspectors. You can see just, if it's actually extended to the depth that it's supposed to be. Lifting the lid of a sediment trap to see if it's connected to the pipes per the plan. And just making sure that, mulch, just checking out, make sure it's not covering something that isn't soil. Sometimes people will have like a concrete pad that they haven't removed, and they'll just put mulch over top of it. So, just be aware of what's on the plans. And then lastly, we are allowed to do a driveway test, which means we're running water on the driveway to see if the water actually flows to the BMPs. And if you're doubting it, then it's a water test is in order. And I've been out there where I was like, there's no way water is going to this BMP. And lo and behold, it actually did. So it's important to do the driveway test to make sure that water is actually flowing to where it's intended. Okay, so standard infiltration BMP requirements. This is something that's new. It's going to be rolled out in June. This is specifically for infiltration BMPs. This is standard sizing for drip line and driveway BMPs. It's focused on single family residential and small multifamily residential, which is 4 units or less. It's only applicable to high capability land. And it's important that you are familiar with what the infiltration rate is for the property, because the sizing, the standard sizing of these systems will depend on what that infiltration rate is.
And real quick, if you don't mind, just to point out, at the top of the training, we sent out a link to the residential guidelines for BMPs. This is an important piece to point out. As Shay mentioned, this is a new option that is being available to applicants, where instead of doing the complicated calculation sheet, if a property is meeting certain criteria and requirements, they could propose more standardized BMP. So you can think of it as kind of a copy and paste versus a real customized approach. And so this is on page 16, Appendix A of those guidelines.
And yeah, just thanks, Jen. The thing that is important here is these are optional. Properties don't have to use these. They can use them if they meet the criteria. No site constraints. We don't want to have any properties that have high groundwater or steep slopes or bedrock to be able to use these. And they need to provide a site plan that actually shows what their property is. You can't just say, okay, I'm using the standard BMPs. You still have to have a site plan that shows where these standard BMPs are going to be installed so the inspectors have something that they can look at. The site plan should have their parcel boundaries, all impervious cover, footprints, driveways, where the land capability boundaries are. Again, the contributing areas from all impervious surfaces, these are the drainage areas that we are showing what is going where. So driveways, roof planes, walkways, and then stormwater flow lines depicting with an arrow where the runoff from these contributing areas are flowing to. And we really want to, we just want to have a clear site plan that's showing where everything is going. On the site plan, you're going to be showing where the drip line BMPs are located, any gutter downspouts, driveway BMPs. Source control BMPs still apply. The standards are for infiltration BMPs, but all of the source control BMPs that we went over, paved driveways, parking barriers, fire defensible space, these still need to be shown on the site plan, as do temporary construction BMPs. And then there's a whole list of standard BMP notes that again are in the permitting guidelines that should be included if they choose the standard BMPs. So the drip line and the driveway BMPs, this is what we're going to go over for what the standard treatments are. And I'm going to go through this kind of fast so we have time to go over the calc sheet. Okay, so roof drip line option number 1 is rock armor. So again, you're putting a 3-inch layer of drain rock out 5 feet from the exterior wall. You can use drain rock or cobble when flat or baffled, or you can use angular rock riprap on slopes. Non-flammable border, and making sure that you extend 1 foot beyond the drip line ends. And you want to have the subgrade sloped 2% away from the foundation. And we have some links to the armored drip line detail sheet and the riprap detail sheet. So this shows you a terrace drip line, the image on the right, with using the non-flammable baffles. We have broken out the sizing based on the soil types. So if you have a roof area that's 0 to 400 square feet or 400 to 1600 square feet, then we have the sizing, the sizing for what is needed. If it's 0 to 400 square feet, you just need a 3-inch layer on top. If it's 401 to 1600, then it needs to be 1 inch deep, either 18, 24, or 30 inches wide, depending on how many stories it is, directly under the roof drip line, and then the rest of the 5 feet is 3 inches on top. And we break out this for if you have a rapid soil, 12.8, 5.7 inch per hour soil, or an average soil, 4 inch an hour or less. 4 inch per hour, between 4 inch per hour or 5.7. If you have an infiltration rate that's less than this, then you're likely not going to be meeting the requirements to do the standard BMPs because you'll probably have a site constraint. Yes, Teresa?
Go back to that. So on the armor depth for the 400 to 1600, it's, in this case, it's 6 inches for that width, and then plus an additional 3 inches, so 9 inches deep?
No, it's 6 under the drip line. So if you have the drip line centered under the drip line, depending on how many stories, if it's 1 story, it's 18 inches, 2 stories, it's 24 inches, 3 stories, it's 30 inches. For that width, centered under the drip line, it's 6 inches deep. For the rest of the space that's 0 to 5 feet from the exterior wall out 5 feet, it is a 3-inch layer on top.
Okay.
And that's just because we had to make everything calc out, because even though, some properties that or have a faster soil, maybe it's going to be size bigger. When we had this go through legal, everything had to calc out. So that's why we have, things are a little bit complicated here, but.
And if I could just real quick, if you don't mind going back to this slide too. So again, TRPA is presenting new standardized BMPs. So instead of doing the full calculation sheet and coming up with, okay, what are the varying depths and width based on all the contributing surfaces, if a property is meeting XYZ criteria, they can essentially, quote unquote, copy and paste. So, okay, I'm doing this dimension, standard dimension under all my drip lines. So it is truly kind of a copy and paste of dimensions. The slide previously where Shay was showing the calculation sheet, that was just showing our methodology. How did we come up with this copy
sizing
and paste sizing?
Yeah, exactly.
And it was the BMP going through kind of a rigorous study of what would be appropriate for the majority of residential properties meeting this criteria.
And just to emphasize what Jen just said, this is only for single-family residential properties that are meeting the criteria. And single-family residential is the lowest polluting land use. Roofs more so than driveways, but we have a considerable amount of staff resources that are spent assisting with infiltration calculations. And we also have certain parameters that you can't go more than 10 inches deep next to the foundation. So we just wanted to standardize some of these treatments to make it easier for people to comply and less time for you all reviewing, every single roof plane calced out, but it's optional. So if somebody wants to calc out everything, they can. This is just trying to make it easier.
Yeah, and I know we're sensitive on time. In June, TRPA will be rolling out our new residential application, and it will include this standard option for residential property owners. So they're actually going to be telling us, what option do I want to do? Do I want to do standardized, or do I want to do the standard, like customized, BMPs?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so roof option 2 is a linear rock-lined basin. So this is basically like a V-shaped ditch or basin. We're using the basin part of the calc sheet to size this out. Again, it's placed centered under the roof drip line. It extends 1 foot beyond the drip line ends. It does not exceed 10 inches of depth because of that building code requirement next to the foundation. If there's a slope, then we want to install check dams. We have links to the check dam BMP to help baffle that open linear basin down the slope. And I guess it could be used, vegetation can be used too, as long as it's herbaceous, but it's probably just easier to use rock lined. And for rapid soils, basically we have 3 feet wide by 6 inches deep, 5.7 inch per hour. We have 3 feet wide, 6 inches deep if it's 0 to 600 square feet. 4.5 feet wide by 6 inches deep if it's 601 to 1600. And that's kind of that's the average soil. 4 inch per hour, 3 feet wide, 6 inches deep, 5 feet wide, 6 inches deep if it's 601 to 1600. So depending on the square footage, we have different sizing, different standard sizings. And this, again, the calc sheet's just showing our kind of backup documentation that was used to, show the methodology of how we came up with this sizing.
Right. If someone's selecting this standardized BMP option, they're actually not providing a calc sheet.
Correct. I'm just showing that to you so you know how we came up with the sizing. It wasn't just like made up. Okay, so gutter downspouts are in here. Many of you are probably thinking, hey, that's not an infiltration BMP, that's a conveyance BMP. But sometimes you'll have people that have those installed to convey roof runoff down to the infiltration. So we just want to make sure that there is rock or cobble at the discharge point to dissipate the flow, and that is then going to discharge to rock armor or a linear infiltration basin or a dry creek bed to convey it to a rain garden. And depending on, those will be sized accordingly depending on how big the roof size is. And this just shows some examples of what that might look like, where you have, you know, a gutter downspout that then is discharging into a gravel area or being conveyed to some other kind of treatment. If it's on a slope, we want to make sure, again, using angular rocks so that it doesn't roll out of place. Okay, so driveway BMPs. Option 1, gravel dry well with slash infiltration system. We want to make sure this is installed with a sediment trap and a border. You need to install a slotted channel drain if it's more than 5% slope, or a swale if it's less than 5% slope. And we just had links to some of those details. We have the sizing here, which is basically for rapid soils. We have a 3x3x3 with the sediment trap. We also show from the calc sheet that the sediment trap, because that's 100% void space within the gravel, it provides added capacity. And it breaks it down depending on the size of the driveway, how big this needs to be. And if you have a driveway that's more than 1,600 square feet, then maybe you're having multiple treatments as you go down, or a road that has multiple treatments as you go down. And then we break it out for 5.7 inch per hour or 4.0 inches per hour. Driveway option 2 is a rain garden or infiltration basin. This is using the 2-to-1 sloped rock line or vegetation basin section of the calc sheet. That's how we came up with the sizing. And we have a link to the infiltration basin detail sheet. So if it's a 0 to 500 square foot, then it's 6 feet by 6 feet by 6 inches deep, 501 to 1,000, 8 feet by 8 feet by 6 inches deep, or 1,001 to 1,600, 10 feet by 10 feet by 12 inches deep. This can also be used for a roof as well. If you have a gutter downspout that then you're conveying with a dry creek bed to a rain garden, the same sizing applies depending on the infiltration rate. For driveways, we want to install a sediment trap. If it's a roof, you don't need the sediment trap because the roof is clean. So this just breaks down the size for the different soil types. And then I can jump into calc sheet review, unless there's any questions on the standard BMPs. Okay. I have all these slides in here for BMPs, and these might be useful to like read through, but I also had just the calc sheet pulled up that I thought maybe I could just drive through, and that might be easier for people to see what we're looking at.
Oh, I have a question from Stacy at Foster.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and sorry, I was trying to get to my mute button. I mean, so, and maybe it's coming, and I'll just be patient throughout the presentation. But I'm curious if there was any discussion on whether or not like fake grass could be used and how that's applied, or is that just a hard no? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Like,
so fake grass, artificial turf,
yeah.
We don't consider it a BMP. People can install it, but it does count as coverage because it doesn't meet, even though it can infiltrate through, it doesn't meet our definition or I guess it meets our definition of coverage because it doesn't allow vegetation to grow through it. So people can use it, but they have to have coverage available to use it. I don't recommend using it within the 5-foot non-combustible perimeter because it is flammable, and it could ignite and you know, cause a structure to start on fire.
And there's definitely a growing concern about the use of AstroTurf because of microplastics.
Yeah.
Plastics. Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to confirm. Thank you so much.
Have we heard of any material artificial turf that is not plastic?
No,
No, okay.
I haven't. I
And
mean,
then-
it's a concern because people just,
And then we do have a question from Janie at Placer. Are the standard BMPs utilizing the standard details or new details?
they're using we have links to the standard details. We just have the sizing, what sizing they are depending on how much surface area is being treated and what the soil infiltration rate is.
Yeah, so no new details for standardized BMPs. We're using the existing details. Essentially, we're attempting to make it simpler for the applicant. I know we're covering a lot of information today, but in a nutshell, the standardized BMPs are, okay, for your driveway, choose option A or B and use those dimensions. For your drip lines, choose option A or B and use those dimensions.
Okay, so looking at our calc sheet, this calc sheet is used to size infiltration systems. So you're only using it for infiltration BMPs. If a property is site constrained and is only doing source control BMPs, they don't need to submit this. And basically the yellow cells are what you fill out, and then the white cells get auto-populated. So first you want to start by putting in the APN, and if you don't know the APN, we have a link to our BMP database where you can look up the APN from the address, and once you put in the APN, it'll auto-populate the address, and it'll auto-populate all of the soils information from the 2007 NRCS soil survey. Important things to look up here, you can put the date and who it's designed by. That's not going to be you, that's going to be the consultant. The important things to look at to determine if there's any site constraints and if infiltration is even possible, we have where the water table is mapped at, if there's any other soil restrictions. In this case, this property shows that there is water table at 10 inches, which means that the max depth of install for any infiltration system is 0 inches because we cannot maintain that 1 foot separation from the bottom of an infiltration system and seasonal high groundwater. It also says we have fragic properties at 12 inches. So that usually means some kind of impermeable layer within the soil, whether it's bedrock, it'll say bedrock, but this is usually some other kind of soil layer that doesn't allow water to pass through. And so this is really important because it's going to influence how deep you can actually install something. In this case, your depth for install is going to be all 0, and this property is likely site constrained. The other thing we want to look at down here is the mapped KSAT. This is the infiltration rate. So anything less than 1 inch an hour is site constrained. We don't want people to install like a swimming pool sized BMP. The environmental trade-offs of, infiltrating your drip line versus installing something that's a swimming pool size. We'd rather just say they're site constrained and try to deal with it at the neighborhood level. This section of the calc sheet are intended for drip line infiltration trenches or gravel dry wells. This is if you have one contributing surface and how you're going to size it out for one treatment. So there's one roof plane and one gravel infiltration trench. If you have 2 that are stacked together as you go down the calc sheet, sorry, I went too fast. We have groups of 3 and groups of 4. That's if you have multiple areas that are going to one treatment. And so you can put in all of the sizes. Like let's say I have one roof draining onto another roof and then draining onto the driveway. I can put all of those dimensions in here and then do my treatment to see if they all calc out. So that's this section of the calc sheet. Number of stories, you're going to want to put this in here. If you put in something that says 2 or 3, you're going to be limited to those parameters I talked about before, where you only have 18 inches under the roof drip line if it's 1 story, 24 if it's 2, 36 if it's 3. You can still put something that's 60 inches. It's just not going to do whatever depth you put in For that full 60 inches, it's going to assume a layer of rock armor 3 inches on top. Sometimes people only put the area in the calc sheet, which, you know, if in the case of a roof drip line, it's important to still put the length of the drip line edge so that you can make sure that it is 1 foot longer than either edge of the drip line. Down here, this is the treatment dimensions. Length is in feet, width and depth are in inches. So in this case, for this property, our depth would be 0 inches. We do have some places where you can change the KSAT with an on-site KSAT or on-site water table depths. If anyone puts something in here, like, look, let's say I change this to 24, automatically, boom, my max depth of install says I can go to 12 inches. It's really important that anytime you're looking at a calc sheet, you open up a new calc sheet and spot check it to make sure that you actually are having the same soil map unit and the same numbers come up on your end, because people do Photoshop it. And so those are things that we're looking for. If someone has anything on these on-site depths, that's okay, but we need to have backup documentation showing, okay, you say that your on-site depth is 24 inches. What backup documentation do you have to support that? Maybe they've done a soils hydro or some kind of geotech report, and any of that information should be posted in the notes section. Oh gosh, why is this? Sorry.
And just a quick time check, we only have about 3 minutes left. Would it be okay to see if we have a few questions of our audience? We do have a hard stop at 1:30.
Sure.
And I know we've gone through a lot of material today, so for anyone online or those in the room, if you have questions popping up, I encourage you to jot those down and shoot those over to us. You can either email those to Shay or myself, and we can share with the group and get those answered. So how about any questions from those online or in the room?
Yeah, I just want to jump back to attachment R really quick and make a quick note. The current version of attachment R does include the perpetual maintenance of BMPs being required, but older attachment Rs do not. So
Okay, so the current one does.
Current one
Okay,
does,
okay,
older
very
don't.
good. So
Make sure
use
you
the
use
current
the current.
one. Okay, and I'm happy if we want to schedule another time to like go into the calc sheet more, because I had some examples of things to look at, and since we're running out of time, I'm happy to do that. You know, one thing that's really important is down here is the date. You want to make sure that any calc sheet that you're looking at has a current date or a date that's pretty current. If they have a calc sheet and it has like a 2015 date down here, they shouldn't be using that. They need to be downloading from our website, which again is tahoebmp.org. Here's our homepage, calculation spreadsheet right here. You can click on it and download the file to get the most up-to-date version.
What is an acceptable time period? So 2020 or later? Or?
I mean, I would think it should be used within the same year, because the calc sheet is constantly, we update it every 6 months to reflect current assessor parcel data. And so if they're using something that's, you know, more than a year old, then it's possible that, you know, something has changed and there's an old APN or it's not calcing out correctly. And, you know, when you're on there spot checking, you're going to see some differences.
That's a good point, to point out the data, the template at the bottom. And then TRPA will be requiring the actual Excel spreadsheet from applicants, and encourage our MOU partners. You can do the same as well, to actually ask for the actual spreadsheet, so you can make sure the cells weren't manipulated and things like that, because we definitely see that.
Yep.
Yep.
And, you know, if it is put on the plans, we want to make sure it's in color, because, you know, the cells show up as green or red if there's any problems. Right, so we're at 1:30.
We're at 1:30. Any final questions online?
I guess I just want to ask folks if they'd be interested in doing like a secondary session. We can kind of deep dive more into the calc sheet.
Seeing some head nods, yes, in the
So
room at
maybe,
least.
Jen, you can send out find out a good time or whatever, and we can.
That sounds good. I can definitely do that. Yep, we also got a yes from Heather at Placer with an exclamation point. Yes, more training on the calc sheet would be great.
Okay.
So yeah, we can do a follow-up training, kind of just do more of a deep dive in that and go through some questions.
Okay, so
John,
we're
this-
at through each of the tabs.
Sure, go
John,
ahead.
this-
Oh, was there someone online?
This is John. Had a question. How do you guys deal with BMPs for QEs for modifications and additions? And because all it says is requires an applicant to submit a retrofit plan, but do you guys follow up afterwards to see if it's actually installed?
I mean, we don't do any inspections for QEs. It's usually for, yeah.
It is always at their word for QEs, but they also don't get a BMP certificate with it. without-
Unless they request an inspection.
And then demonstrate it all.
Yeah.
I will say a lot of people that do apply for QEs that are not certified, we prompt them to submit a small BMPR. So it is often tracked that way. And then Joan will go out and do an inspection if they have a small BMPR. So that's typically what we've seen, at least on the BMP side.
Thanks, Angela.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciate the time. We're going to be sending out some follow-up information just with resources and then the recording of today. And then we'll look into doing kind of a refresher part 2 to go into more of a deep dive for the standard BMPs and the calc sheet. But thank you all so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.